I was going to use this mic, but that's fine.
Okay.
I don't know if they're doing echo when I'm like, yeah, so you gotta.
Yeah. Actually, I'll turn it down here in a second when I'm done with it. Good morning. Hope you guys had fun last night. It's nice to see you all here bright and early at 11 in the morning. Yeah, it's hurting my ears too. Hopefully none of you guys are as bad off as Dan Kaminsky was yesterday, or maybe hopefully you guys are that bad off. You guys have fun at the party last night? You guys were able to, yeah, what party? Able to make it? There's some people I know that didn't show up, and I know that got a bit crowded there at some point, so some people weren't allowed to get in right away, but hopefully, did you come back and were able to get in later? Actually, in some respects, you're probably better off, because it was like 120 degrees in there. It was just ridiculous. But hopefully the people that were roasting had a bunch of fun until things got shut down. So right now we've got Scott Molten coming up. He's going to be talking about hacking hard drives and data recovery, and it should be a really interesting talk, so give him a big round of applause.
Can you guys hear me clearly? I'm Scott Molten with Forensic Strategy Services, and this morning that you are here with hangovers with hard drives. So this morning, going through hard drives, I'm trying to break down some of the simple items that you can do to try to recover a hard drive that some of the bigger places might be doing, because most of the time you're not going to get a hard drive that's damaged that your grandma can afford to spend $10,000 getting your data back. Has anybody sent a hard drive off to a data recovery house before? And how much did you pay?
I think it was about $850 6, 7 years ago.
Okay. 8,050, is that what you said? 850. Anybody spend more than that on a data recovery house? How much are you at?
$25,000.
And did they get the data back? Okay, that's great. But your grandma's not going to pay that, is she? So, my presentation is all done in Flash, so it's all animated. You guys can see this presentation on myharddrivedied.com. So if you want to go there and look at it, myharddrivedied.com is where it's at. I'm going to go through some basics here of some of the things that I found out going through breaking hard drives down. I've done about 700 to 800 hard drives by this time of just doing repairs. When I started this business, it was primarily a spin-off from my forensics business, because it's pretty much the same idea. We're using some high-end software, some other items to try to do a data recovery that you just might not be able to do any other way. But I've started finding some cheaper, easier ways to do things that I could tell people so that they could try on their own. One of the big things on this slide that I'm going to talk about that I don't have an animation of later is this actuator lock right here, this little piece of plastic that sticks off of the drive. When the drive starts to spin up, it creates some air pressure, and the air bearing actually causes this piece to just teeter out of the way. There's no mechanics involved in it. It just basically teeters out of the way, and it unlocks the actuator arm so that the head can actually move. So that's your locking mechanism for the hard drive these days. The downside to doing some of the data recovery, some of the new hard drives have almost kind of like a little cap on the top of the drive. And when you take the top of the platters, where the platters, you can actually see the platters. At this point in time, if you were to power up the drive, that actuator lock might not actually flip out of the way. There's not enough air pressure. So sometimes you either have to do it manually or do some other things in the process, and I'm going to show that as we go through this. The other thing that I'm going to point out too is the spindle right here, the spindle cover. If you have platters and they're mounted on the spindle cover, when you take those screws off and you remove the top little piece that holds that metal piece right here, those platters, if there's 2 platters or 3 platters, they'll spin independently. And once that happens, you can never recover your drive again. So this is part of the problem with trying to do like a motor replacement or something like that, because the motor actually is right underneath this cap. When you pull that off, you'll actually see the wires that are wrapped around the magnetic mechanisms and things like that. So it's extremely difficult on a multi-platter system to pull the actual motor out and do a replacement. In a lot of cases, the motor is actually mounted to the casing of the drive, so you just can't pull it out and remove it. So those are 2 of the main things that aren't covered in the rest of the animations, but you need to be cautious about or keep in mind, and I'll cover something when we hit the end. I break this down into 2 segments. The first part is going to be going through the basics of a hard drive and what the things are that I see that are different that you might not already know. And the second part is going to be going through the hard drives that I've done recoveries for and trying to repair them, and when you know it's going to be good and when it's going to be bad and when you can move on. On the bottom on the board itself is unique to the drive. When the manufacturer produces the drive, they make the board to go with that drive at that time. So there is firmware that's on this board that matches some other information that's on the hard drive. And it's changed over time, so it's kind of hard to order which one's going to be important first. So I'll go into this part, and then I'll get into the servo information. But on the board itself, it matches some information that's on the platter. And they switched mechanisms for how the head moves across the platter, and they had the right information on the board. So the board, when you're looking for a drive that you want to try to match for a recovery, you have to get the date as close to the date of the original manufacturer of this drive as possible. And typically I see when we get outside of a 2-week time period that you can't do a recovery because the firmware has changed or something else has changed on the board. So the idea here is that if you were going to repair your own hard drive and you wanted to find another drive so that you could replace this board, you have to try to find the model number and the date as close as possible to within 2 weeks is my preferred method of finding a drive, because you're going to be calling eBay and doing whatever you can to try to get this board. So they basically change from chip to chip, and the manufacturer might have 2 drives that are made in 2 different locations at the same time. So in Korea, you might have one drive being made, and in China, another drive might be made. And they may have identical components other than that, but you'll see like on this particular hard drive, it's identical. It's an IBM hard drive, but the boards are different. So the firmware has changed, which means there's something else about the drive that's changed as well. So you've got to hunt down these exact boards in order to replace them, or you won't be able to do anything to repair that drive. Every hard drive that you guys have right now in any of your laptops actually currently already has errors going on a continual basis. Errors are so common at this point in time on the hard drives that they are not even trying to just make a complete hard drive that doesn't have errors on it. They are trying to do everything they can to fix those errors on the fly. So there are ECC items on the board that try to do error correction while the drive is running and reading that data. So if it gets an error and it can repair it on the fly in the board by doing some error correcting code, then it doesn't even mark that as an error. It doesn't show that as a bad block, and it's going to keep on going. And it's just going to say, okay, fine, I figured out what that bit is, and I'm going to fix it. If it has enough retries on that particular block, it can't get enough data from it, it can't do a repair in the ECC, then it will say, oh, I've retried, and it's different from manufacturer to manufacturer, from drive to drive, how many times it's going to retry before it actually puts a bad block on the board. It's going to say, oh, this block is bad, I'm not going to use this block anymore, I'm not going to try. But before that, it knows there's an error, but it's not going to mark it as bad, and if that block gets erased and later on gets written again and it's okay, it never even notices, it doesn't do anything with it. So not every block that has an error is going to already show up as an error and going to get marked bad. And that's part of this SMART mechanism too. You hear about SMART, and it's basically monitoring, and it's trying to figure out how many errors something's having. It's trying to do a predictability so that it can try to tell you, oh, my drive has 700 bad sectors on it, and you need to get a new drive so that you're not going to keep going on. So we're going to break the hard drive down into its parts now. Now, one of the other things that I run into all the time that people say is a drive is hermetically sealed. You just can't open the case and work on a drive and do those kind of things. And a drive is not hermetically sealed. If you notice, there is probably a hole on almost every one of your drives that says, do not cover this hole. There is air traffic going through the drive, and it's helping it create a nominal amount of pressure so that the pressure can equalize between the outside and the inside. Otherwise, you'd start having problems with your drive at different altitudes and things like that. And there are times where if you're up high enough in a plane that your hard drive could actually crash because there's not enough air pressure to keep the head floating over the platter, and it will hit the platter and start to scrape it. But there are some hermetically sealed ones, like Air Force and things like that have some hermetically sealed drives, but you're not going to find those on the shelf at CompUSA or wherever you're going to go and buy one of these drives. So you can kind of take the cover off of your hard drive and look at it. Unfortunately, after you do that, it's going to degrade, and you're going to have a shorter period of time. But if you've got a drive that's damaged already, this is another one of those kind of things where a lot of the data houses are kind of trying to scare you into going with them or trying to make you send these things in so you can spend your thousands of dollars is, got to have a clean room, you got to do all these other things. And a clean environment can be produced in a number of different ways. There's clean boxes, you can make them out of Tupperware, there's a number of ways to do this. But one of the other things that happens with a hard drive, when the platter starts to spin, the manufacturer already knew at the time that they were manufacturing the hard drive that there were going to be little fragments that were going to come on and off of the platters. And when they start to spin up, it creates an air bearing, and it flings those pieces off of the platters into, and in some cases you'll see when you open up your casing, there's like little tunnels around the edges of the metal of the casing. And they're basically there to capture little fragments as they fly off. They even have a little filter, and it looks like a little tiny pillow. I'm sure, has anybody here opened a hard drive before? And you've seen that little pillow, the little tiny pillow, and some of them are removable. You can just take tweezers and pull them out. And some of them have like a little cap on the top of the metal when you take it off and things like that. But there's really good ways to get an indication of whether or not you've got platter damage further down on a drive by looking at those pillows. Because if they're silver, you might not be able to see the scratch on the top, but there may be a really deep scratch on the bottom because the magnetic media has gotten scraped off. It flings out into those tunnels and gets caught into one of these pillows. And so a lot of times you can know right up front whether you've got some really physical damage by looking at those. So we're going to break the pieces down into the two segments that we basically look at are the platters themselves and the way that the data is written to it. The important piece here is this alignment servo info. Before 1986, every hard drive had a stepping motor. They basically would move this motor an increment at a time with a pulleys, wheels, / whatever. There's different ways that they did it. But it would always move in the same increments. But the problem is that motors are not exact enough that over time they don't degrade their performance as well. They wouldn't move to the same location. So they didn't have the servo info in those original drives. They actually had to keep reading the data and trying to do something with the data. When they came out with a voice coil, which was Connor's gift to us as far as hard drives, because every hard drive you have today has a voice coil in it. When they came out with the voice coil, the motor didn't know where it was when it would move the head of the hard drive over the platter. So the servo info is geographical information that is constantly being read at all times while the head is spinning over the platter. And it will read it and tell the system where I am on the platters at all time. The big thing here is that you can't get to that servo info. You can't read that servo info. This is one of those changes where all of a sudden we have IDE hard drives and we can't low-level format an IDE hard drive, or it really screws the system up if you can even get to the low level. But we all used to low-level our drives before we got to this point. So the servo info is written by a piece of hardware at the manufacturer's plant. So when they change a platter, they change its location or whatever, that servo information gets written back to the first board, the IDE board on the bottom of the drive itself. And that information gets saved there to tell it where you're going and what's going to happen and where this platter is. So that's why when you change the board, if you don't get the exact board that was made at the same time, and it's a little bit of guesswork on getting that board, if you don't get that board, it's not going to know what the servo information was, and it's not going to be able to put that head back in the right place. So that's the most important aspect of doing any of this data recovery stuff. And if you have multiple platters, I kind of mentioned before that if you had multiple platters on a motor, you just couldn't pick them up and move them. Because that's the other question I get all the time is like, okay, well, if the drive is bad, let's just take our platters off and let's go get another drive and put them in that and it'll work. Well, if you have two platters and they free spin when you take those screws off the top, and you'd be surprised at how little there is any pressure or anything in there that holds those platters in place. But the problem is the cylinder, because the data that's written, and especially the servo information that's going to matches from the top of the board to the bottom to the, each platter is exactly aligned above each other. And if it was moved even like a 0.05 microns, it would never line up again, and you would never read the data off of that drive because the piece of data is written on top, and then it's written on the bottom, and then it's written on the top of the next platter. And that's what makes up the cylinder that you always hear, cylinder head, blah, blah, blah. And so that's where that information, if the two platters is turned, that's it. It's all over. You will never be able to read it again, at least not without some really, really extreme measures. So the voice coil is down here on the end of the arm of the hard drive's head. And the voice coil works exactly the way that the speaker does. Basically, it's putting an electrical pulse through the tail, and it causes the arm to move back and forth over the location of the platters. So that's one of the reasons why, because it moves so fast and it moves to a certain location that we can't tell, like we did with the stepping motor, where things are, and that's why the servo information is there at all. So this is the way that this works, and basically the magnets are pulling it in one direction or another, causing that head to move in extreme fashion back and forth. And this head can move back and forth over the platters 60 times per second. That's much faster than the stepping motors that we had up until about 1989. And Seagate and several other manufacturers were still doing that up until 1989 before they switched over to the voice coil that we use now. The air pressure, basically the way that this works is the head of the hard drive used to actually sit on the platter. In the early 1950s, when they first made the hard drives, the IBM made them so that they had tracks on each side of the heads, and it sat on the platter and scraped along the platter on the orange stuff, which used to be the iron oxide. It's basically rust on the platter. So you can imagine that as the head was moving over the platter, if there's rails and they're touching the platter, eventually it's going to cause a lot of wear and tear, and these drives are going to go bad. And these things you would have 24-inch platters, and there could be 50 of them in one hard drive. And so when one went bad, it was extremely costly and extremely difficult to get in and replace one and get one running. So basically through an anomaly, one of the guys figured out that when the platters are spinning fast enough, if you took some of that weight off of the head, it would actually float over the platter. And so by 1963, they switched over to having a head that floats over the platter, and it's never gone back since then, because it basically eliminates that whole wear and tear that would actually happen on the drive. So when you hear that a head hit the platter and you have a crash, sometimes it doesn't actually cause a crash, but it can physically scratch the platter and do things. Most of the time now when a head hits the platter, what actually happens is the head itself gets damaged because it's a small piece that sits at the end. This is the way we basically write data on a platter at this point in time. We use this longitudinal recording mechanism, and this has been in existence for 50 years up until basically this year. This past year has been the first time that we've actually had drives that were introduced that were different than this method. So it hasn't really changed over time at all. The only thing that has really changed is the areal density of the drive. So as we've increased the amount of space that we can write data on, it starts to cause this problem where you get bits that are flipping. And that's called the Superparamagnetic Effect. And they've known that this was going to happen. They continually do math to try to predict when the bits are going to get messed up, when they're going to flip. And this gets beyond what the ECC data can recover from. When the ECC data is reading this, if there are too many flip bits, it will not be able to read this at all, and you'll eventually get a drive that just can't read anything. It'll just completely mess up everything that's happening. So this is the new drives, like that new 750 gig Seagate that just came out. They just switched over to a perpendicular recording mechanism, which instead of writing them long, it writes them up and down so that you can read the data and have more density in a smaller amount of area. Their goal is to make it so that your drive can spin faster, the head can read faster, and that your data is still intact, whatever the way that they're going to do it affects the drive. So they've switched a number of times to different mechanisms, and they use glass platters. Some of the drives use glass platters, and some of the drives use aluminum. And so they're trying to basically make them lighter and thinner so they can spin faster, and then they increase the density and also go to this perpendicular recording mechanism, and that's how we get a drive that has a single platter or just two platters at this point in time. That's typically the maximum. I've seen a few drives that have 3 platters, like a Western Digital drive and things like that. But the platters of the old days where we would have 8 platters or 9 platters in a drive, that's being removed, and we're basically getting down to a smaller subset of those drives so that we can try to increase the density and write that data to those drives and get more data on one physical drive. This is a new thing that basically just got patented by Seagate, and their idea is to use heat-assisted magnetic recording. They call it HAMR. And this is a little bit scary to me because as densities increase and I'm trying to do data recoveries, it could be a really big problem, but now they're trying to introduce this idea that the head is now flying too far away from the platter. If we want to read the data better, we need to get the head closer to the platter. So they're introducing an idea that we're going to move the head closer to the platter, but now we've got problems with evaporation of lubrication and things like that. So we're going to try to make it a tougher material, and we're going to heat it up so that we can change that bit and write back and forth to that bit. And so that's why you see that they've got a laser here on the end, and they're basically zapping the area, heating it up, writing the data to it. It's evaporating the lubrication that's on it, which they call nanotubes. So this really is a series of tubes. The nanotubes are the lubrication that's going to fit between this layer and keep that head from touching the platter and doing those things. But that seems really scary to me. I don't know if you guys are scared by it, because just from the fact of, yes, it might increase your density, and they think they can go 10 times the density. Now, they haven't said if they plan to use this in the perpendicular recording mechanisms items as well. So I think we're going to get a mixture of things. But, you know, if you could go to, 2 terabyte, 3 terabyte pretty quickly, I think most of you would buy it. But we may end up 2 or 3 years down the road with some mechanism that is faulty and doesn't hold up to time. So this is the basics of how the operating system reads and writes files. Now, if you're trying to do a data recovery, this is pretty violent. So if you've got a sector, or if you've got something that's wrong with the drive and it's scratched or whatever, and the head is moving over that platter that fast, there's a really good chance that you're going to hit a bad spot, and you're going to try to it'll actually damage the head, and you won't be able to read that data at all. So the ideal method of trying to do a recovery is to do a bit stream type image, where you actually read the data from one end of the platter to the other end of the platter as smoothly as possible. And there's some advantages to that. One of the advantages is that typically you'll know where it fails, and you'll get whatever data you read up to the point that it fails. So if you have some software that you're trying to do, and what I mean by this is things like DD Rescue, and imaging programs, forensic imaging programs, those types of applications will try to read the bit stream sectors rather than the OS. They're not looking at the files, and they're not looking at how things are physically on the platters. They're reading it from beginning to end and trying to image it. And coincidentally, if you're doing a RAID, you have to do this. There's no other option. There is no OS. You got one bad drive in a set of drives. You're going to have to image that drive, and you'll probably have to image the rest of the drives that you have that are good to try to reassemble them into some manner with software or whatever else that you can do. And there are pieces of software that can reassemble RAID and try to guess things and work things out. And as you can see, for the most part, I'm trying to address the physical problems of a drive regardless of the OS. So it doesn't matter for the most part what OS you're using. If you're imaging a drive and you're doing a DD, it doesn't matter if you're using Windows 3 to Linux drive or using Linux to read a Mac drive, things like that. So you're trying to narrow down what your scope is going to be so that it doesn't matter what kind of errors and what kind of things that you can have going on. And most of the recovery programs that are out there try to read a drive as if the OS mounted it. So that's kind of a bad story when you're looking at how most of the recovery software works, because if it's scanning the drive and it's moving around with the files, or it's trying to skip around on the platters, it may be causing more damage, and you may use up the 1 or 2 good times that you have left to try to get this data back. And most of the time, that's a pretty big deal, because I will tell you that on a damaged drive, it really matters that first time or that second time. There's people who keep trying, they'll plug it in, and one day it works, the next day they plug it in and it doesn't work, and so on and so on. You're using up your last few chances to try to get that data back. So once you know that a drive is done, you need to be prepared to try to copy those files off in the easiest fashion that you can. So I'm going to go into some of the basics of trying to actually do the data recovery and reassemble a drive when there's a problem. In the years that I've been doing this, the numbers have pretty much worked out like this. 85% of the problems, at least for that first round, even if it's a physical problem, a lot of times you can read it with software. And you may need to practice with some software, look at some software. On the website, the myharddrivedied.com, there is a list of some things that I've tried and worked on. There's free stuff, there's for-pay stuff, there's some discount stuff there. Most of the time, things like DD Rescue and things like that are going to be your first defense to try to go and get that image of that and get something off of it. The other thing is, too, is that you might want to play with some software that when you know what the sector is that's bad, some of the software can actually let you skip those sectors. So you can pretty much say, I want an image from this sector to that sector, and then stop it and get that image, and then start at the next sector. And if the head can move past that, then you can read from there to the end of the drive. And then you can use carving software and forensic software. And you know, a lot of times people kind of skip forensic software when they're doing a data recovery. And that's kind of a bad idea because there's some good stuff out there that's free, there's good stuff out there, and there's a lot that's for pay, but I mean, Encase and things like that get up until like $3,000 to do a data recovery. But you don't need that stuff 99% of the time to actually just get your data back in some sound manner so that you can recover the files. So this 15% of hardware, this is the breakdown of what I'm looking at for 15%. The electronics is the biggest one. The board that I brought up at the beginning, where the board fails, you'll get a clicking noise. Sometimes the clicking noise can be two things. It can actually be physical head damage, you know, can't read it off the platter, and then the rest of the time it ends up being a board. A board got fried. Static electricity is really bad around hard drives. Most hard drives are fairly durable. People plug them in, unplug them. They don't use static guards as much as they should, things like that. But that is the biggest killer and kills that board right away. So typically, if you haven't had any signs that your drive is dying and you moved it from one system to another, that's typically what happened is you got some static electricity and shocked that board and it died. And it seems to me, and I'm not going to pick on any particular manufacturer, but my numbers so far seem to indicate that Western Digitals get fried more often from static electricity than they do by physical damage otherwise. Other drives, when I actually get them in for recovery, the board seems to be fairly resilient, but you know, they actually have a physical problem or some damage or something along that line. So just be a little bit more cautious, use your anti-static stuff and do what you need to do. But already, just because I just told you, 85% you can do that first pass with software, and 10% you just got to hunt down this board. You've got a 95% chance now of getting back your data without having some physical problem or you know, doing it some other way or shipping it off. So the heads and the platters, I put those together because most of the time that's what happens. They get together, and when that happens, that's where the bad news comes from. And then the 1% is your motor, and that's really bad news. So here's my rules when I'm training one of my guys and trying to get them up to par. I've got 8 guys that are trained to do recoveries, and they take systems apart, blah, 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 and so on. The first thing is not to be emotionally attached. So if it's your hard drive, sometimes you're going to be a little more emotional than you need to be. And the truth of the matter is, you do not need your porn back this week. You can live one more week without your porn. So you need to be a little removed from that and go get new porns from someplace else. Damaged hard drives do not do the same thing twice. And I quite literally mean that exactly the way that says it. That one day you'll plug it in and a damaged hard drive will work. The next day you plug it in and it doesn't. And it goes back and forth. But like I said, you have a limited number of times that when you plug a hard drive in to do a recovery that you may actually be able to get that data back. So try to be prepared the very first time you plug it in. Have lots of free space available. And when I mean free space, I mean that's a real key down here on this free space is your friend. Because if you have to do an image and you get lucky enough that maybe your OS mounted it, you might need to do 2 or 3 things at the same time and try to limit the amount that you're going to lose. If you plug in a hard drive and you're on a Windows system and the OS mounts it, you need to know exactly what files that you need first. So if your grandma gave you this and she said, I need QuickBooks back, then you just skip everything else and you go straight to the QuickBooks folder and you don't do anything. Don't try to do 2 copies at once. Don't say, I got my pictures of Jimmy over here in my documents folder and I'm going to copy those out too. You wait for each process to stop and finish before you go and get the next copy. And you do it systematically in order, 1, 2, 3, in the order of importance. Don't go getting OS files and things like that. And that's kind of the bad thing about some of the recovery programs is that they don't ask you about what files you're looking for. Most of the time they'll go and say, I'm going to scan your whole hard drive, and that includes your OS and all your program files. And 99% of the stuff that you're looking for is going to be in the My Documents folder on a Windows system. On a Mac system, you're always going for the user folder. The rest of the stuff is just crap. You can restore that stuff or get it from some other place. The only difference there is that you also need to know things like about Intuit software. Sometimes Intuit actually puts their stuff in the program files directory or in another directory someplace else. So if somebody says, I got Quicken, QuickBooks, TAC, TurboTax, any of that kind of stuff, you go after those things in those other folders first before you move on. Persistence kind of goes with this whole thing with damaged hard drives don't do the same thing twice, because just as an example, like I worked on a hard drive all week one week, couldn't get it to mount, and I knew that the platter wasn't damaged, so I kind of persistent for about a week with a drive before I go on to looking for parts and things like that. But I plugged it in on a Friday. I was just kind of sick of it, and I went home. I came back on Monday, and it was mounted and running, and it was working fine. So I was able to get the recovery done and then move the drive off and do whatever. But most people aren't going to try to use that drive again after it's damaged, so you're just going to throw it away after you're done. Don't try to keep it going for another week or something. Heat is not your friend. And some of you probably read this tech document, the Tech Republic document that says like 200 ways to recover. You guys read that? Anybody here? There's a thing that says 200 ways to recover your hard drive, and they basically give you like 3 sections. One of them says freeze your hard drive. That's number 1. Number 2 is like hit your hard drive with a hammer or something like that. And it's some pretty bad news. It's some pretty bad advice in some cases. Freezing your hard drive, if you do that, most of the time what you're going to do is get condensation on your platters. Water is going to get inside the board, and as soon as the temperature reaches more than 70 degrees, going from 0 to 70 or something, it's going to cause this condensation. It's going to cause the drive to fail. But cooling the drive is a really good idea. It's really a smart idea to try to keep it as cold as possible while it's running, and typically it wants to be in the 70 degree range, but most of our drives are running at about 120 degrees. Most of you don't realize that, especially like Macs, they seem to get a little bit hotter where the drive is in their laptops than any place else. So if you're doing any kind of monitoring and stuff like that, you'll see them running at like 117, 123 degrees. And that's some pretty bad news too, because metal expands. Glass doesn't expand as much. So when you've got somebody who's using like a IBM hard drive and the platters are made of ceramic material, there's ceramic and glass, they're kind of used universally as far as the way that they're talked about, but they do not expand as much. So typically you'll have a little bit better luck with heat with those drives. But the side effect of that is that because they're glass, that if the head does hit the hard drive, hit the platter, it is going to scratch it, and you will see pixie dust going all over the place. And everybody on eBay is your friend. You will have to call them, contact them, email them. When you're looking for a particular drive, when you go to eBay and you pull up a drive and somebody's got like 3 drives laid out and say for sale, that could have been somebody else's picture. They just pasted it into their stuff. So when you order that drive, you're going to be really disappointed when you see it's not the same serial number and it's not the same thing. So you need to let these people know when you're looking for a particular drive, the model and the date. Most of them will tell you up front. They'll tell you for free. They'll email you or whatever. They know you're looking for a particular drive. But if you get some of these guys who know you're looking to do a data recovery, they jack that price up. So now it becomes like $100 extra to go and look for this drive that you need to find. But if you're looking for a rare one, and that's the other thing is that sometimes one week you might not find it on eBay, but next week you will. So, if you're not emotionally attached to it and you put it aside and you wait a week, you might actually get it next week. And that works out pretty well. It's a good method to go through. You just need to kind of wait and be cautious. So you want to try everything before you open this case. So if you don't really have a clean environment, again, if you go to my website and you look at where you can make like a Tupperware thing, I've got a link to actually tell you how to make a clean room of your own where you can disassemble that drive and you're in good shape. Most of the time, you'll actually be okay just in a clean spot just to get that drive running. Because how many of you are going to open up your drive and then you're going to keep using it after you've opened it?
Lasted for about 9 minutes.
Yeah, but after that, you're not going to like plug it in and put all your new porn on it on your for the next 6 months, are you?
It was kind of toasty.
Yeah, it's pretty toasty. After you open it and you expose it to the environment, there's a much better chance it's going to die later on. But you've already had a problem with it, so. Hard drives are cheap by comparison. I mean, if the data that's on there is small, it's pretty easy to get something cheap, even memory sticks and things like that, just to get by. But you don't want to keep using a hard drive that's even partially or possibly damaged for any permanent stuff. You could probably keep your OS running on it and keep another data drive going, but you don't want to do that. You want to look at your logic board carefully. I'm going to show you in a minute what happens to the logic board and how you can actually tell if there's something wrong with the board on the bottom. And different connectors do different stuff. And this is really true. If you use a FireWire on a drive, sometimes it won't mount, but then you can plug it into a USB. Sometimes it will mount. And also the other thing is that an IDE controller that's on the board, like on your motherboard, or if you get a separate IDE controller and plug it in, it has better error handling. So you have a lot better chance of using an imaging application and doing something like DD rescue to read each sector on the drive and getting that data back, because it will constantly retry if the software tells it to. And that's exactly what DD rescue does and things like that. There's some others, like there's a free one that's called FTK Imager for Windows. So if you're not, you know, because DD rescue is not going to run on your Windows box. So if you want to try a really quick one and you have a Windows box, it doesn't matter if the hard drive mounts. A lot of times if you go into Device Manager and you look at the devices, if it tells you under your hard drives the correct model number of your drive, it doesn't matter if it mounted, and you can go into your disk view and see the, you know, the whole layout and all of your partitions. So don't think that that's the big deal. It doesn't have to show any partitions at all. That's actually, again, just a software view of what's actually happening on your system, and it doesn't know. So if it shows up in Device Manager under hard drives, the hard thing there is looking for that model number to make sure. Like, for instance, Western Digital drives, when the board's fried and you plug it in, it'll say it's a 2 terabyte drive. I don't know why it says it's a 2 terabyte drive, but the firmware will instantly fry, say, 2 terabytes, and that's what it'll do. So that's a good indication that the logic board is bad. And that happens with some of the others, but typically Western Digital's is the one that's going to do that. And I'm not trying to pick on them, because Seagate and Maxtor and all of them have their problems, and they're all going to die sooner or later. So it's just going to happen sooner or later. The other thing is, too, different OSs. You'd be really surprised. Like, for instance, and I'm going to give you Mac guys a simple one here, because this is not picking on you guys either, because I got Macs and I love them too. But when a Mac partition gets corrupt or something happens to it, Mac's software at repairing that sucks. It can't do it. Most of the time, it'll say, oh, linker error or something else, and it'll show up, or it just won't mount the drive. And a lot of people that have Macs, sometimes they only have a Mac. So their other computer might be a Mac too. So they take the hard drive out and they go over and they plug it into another Mac. That Mac's not going to see it either. Neither one of them's going to be able to see it. So I get those in for recovery all the time. And so a lot of the guys who, because I do, if you call CompUSA, or if you go to Micro Center or Pro Onsite or a bunch of these other guys, we have deals with those guys, because we don't typically market to the public. We make deals with those guys to send us their hard drives for repair. So if you called those guys, they're going to ship it to me. But the Apple guys at CompUSA will send me their hard drives. Most of the time, it's simple stuff. The hard drive itself hasn't actually died. There's not a problem with the drive. The drive itself is fine, but Mac can't read it. And the people who tried to do everything did it all on Macs. So you get a Windows box, you pay $49 for Mac Drive. Mac Drive will read the drive with the error, and it will just display a little box and says, this drive is set to read only because it has an error in it, and blah, blah, blah. But it lets you go straight to all the files. You could just skip all that stuff, and so $49, you just solved your problem. All you got to do, though, you can't fix the problem, and you can't make it reboot. So what you've got to do is you've got to copy your files out, and then go back to your Mac and reinstall your OS, and then copy your files over. It's just a lot quicker, a lot shorter time to do a repair. And so $49, I just fixed most of your Mac problems right there. And try different angles, upside down, sideways, things like that. It really does matter. If you flip a drive over, sometimes it'll run, amazingly enough. It has a lot to do with when it heats up and it expands, and now the platter's in a certain space and it's hitting the top of something, blah, blah, blah. If you flip it over, now it's got a little bit more momentum running in a different direction. So you want to try that before you go and open it. And you'd be surprised, again, persistence pays off. Sometimes you hook it up and you let it run for 10 hours and come back and it's working. So it's just pretty rare. So if that's your last chance, then try those things. And then fans and cooling trays. I'm going to show you something here I've been trying. And I always pronounce this wrong, as Peltier cooler. Peltier cooler. It's a ceramic cooling item. And basically, this one came out of a device you can buy for $20 at CompUSA. This is that little USB cooler for your cup. You put your cup on it and it cools your cup off. Well, the components of it, if you try to order them, are probably going to cost you more money than that thing cost. So it has a heat sink in it and has everything that you need to go and do that. So you can buy that, take it apart, and this is what you're going to see inside. It already has a USB connector, so you already got your power. When you plug this in, what's going to happen is one of these directions is going to be spitting off the heat. One section is going to suck the heat from one side and freeze whatever's on that side, basically, and spit it off on the other side. So you can take that and you assemble it. Like I put these in these metal trays like this. You guys have probably seen these if you're modding systems or doing anything. You just put your hard drive in it because it basically becomes a heat sink while you're working on it. And you want to suck all the heat away from your drive as much as possible. And then put the drive in it. It's important, too, that you're making contact with the metal when you're using something like a Peltier cooler, because it wants to touch that metal and suck it off. If you've got labels on your drive and you're sticking it right there, it's not going to really help you at all. It'll do a little bit, but it's not going to do a whole lot. But typically, the Peltier coolers, the number of them that you use, can bring the temperature of the drive down to about 40 degrees. So you can actually run fairly cold while it's running. And then this is the heatsink, came out of that same device, the cooler. And so I have the Peltier cooler right underneath it. And then you can use 2 or 3 of these in sequence too. You can either put them side by side, but if you actually stack them like little cakes, it'll suck it off and it'll get colder on the bottom one. So you can play around with some of that stuff just to keep it cold. But so for 20 bucks, and take your labels off and stick your stuff, you can probably keep your drive running fairly cold. The electronics, the board itself. If you touch this board in certain areas while it's running and you plug it into like a USB power adapter or whatever, and you can feel where extreme heat is on this. And a lot of times what will happen is when you touch at certain spots, you can actually find where the short is in this. So you already know, I got a short, something bad is happening here, and you can feel the heat up to a certain spot, and then it stops. It doesn't go to the other chips, and you don't feel it. And when I took the board off and I flipped it over, this is what I saw on the other side. So this is common. You would be surprised. Sometimes I see little diodes or things like it, but they fry. They smoke. Things happen. Sometimes they smell. But you can basically take that board off, replace the board. The drive's in great shape. No problem with it. And actually, at that point in time, I haven't opened the drive. So just replacing the electronics on the board is fairly simple. There's 4 screws on the bottom of your board, and there's no soldering contacts or anything like that. It physically just contacts the drive. So there's nothing like loop back inside off of that board. It's 4 screws and some contact on the outside, powers up both the power for the motor and makes the contact for everything inside the hard drive itself. So that's a fairly simple thing to do, and that's always your first line of defense. Because no matter what you do after that, you're still going to have to buy a duplicate drive. You're going to have to get the exact drive, and you're going to have to do everything else anyway. So you want to make sure that the new drive that you bought actually works, so you power it up. Don't be so anxious to take the board off and go put it on your old drive. Make sure it's working. Make sure the board works. Then take the board off, move it to the drive. Make sure that that's running. If you're lucky, you might just be done right there. You might get your whole copy, and you might be finished. Otherwise, you might not hear a motor spin up, or you might not hear other things happening. And sometimes there's no way to test that motor easily without having that exact board either, because you don't want to go playing around too much with voltages and things like that unless you want to spend some time sending it to a data recovery house. So a head crash. Sometimes the head doesn't fall off like that. Sometimes it just hangs there and drags along the platter and does some more damage. But it's typically that's what we're looking at when we look at a head crash. So I actually replaced this one and got this drive back up and running. You can see the reflection here is basically hanging, and nice close-up of that. But I replaced the head of that one and was able to recover the data off that drive, and it worked just fine. The hardest part about this one was that the head actually parked on the inside of the platter instead of the outside of the platter, and I'll go into that in a few minutes. So you're replacing damaged heads. Now, you can't go to Jensen and ask, hey, give me your head replacement kit. You're not going to get a head replacement kit. They don't know what you're talking about. There are no tools specifically made for doing this. There's probably only a handful of people who even try to do these kind of things. But you're going to end up trying to make your own tools, and this is paper. This is a yellow Post-it note, and you're going to fold it, and I'll show you how it holds them apart. But the whole point here is I'm lucky enough on this particular drive to have a ramp. That's pretty much on all the Hitachi/IBM drives, there's going to be a ramp. Some of the Seagates and some of the Western Digitals have a ramp on the outside. That's really nice because this ramp basically holds the 2 heads apart, and you can keep the 2 heads lined up. And so your piece of paper here, your whole point for that piece of paper is to hold these 2 pieces away from each other, about the same configuration that they're in the ramp, so that when you slide it out, that they don't touch each other. Once they touch each other and the 2 ends hit each other, it's a done deal. It's a lot easier if you've already taken out your good drive, your old drive stuff first before you switch over from the new drive, so you have some place to put it, because you can't really sit these things down or anything. It'll take you about 2 hours to do a head replacement like this, and you just have to be patient. But if you're careful, it'll work very well for you, and you'll actually be able to read that data again. So you take the piece out of your old one. The only thing that's there is on this bottom piece right here before you take the head off. This piece has usually got a screw in it that goes through to the other side for the contacts for the IDE board. Once you remove that piece, it's fairly easy to take it out, but you got to do a little bit of wiggling and jiggling just to get it right so that it comes out of the side and doesn't do any other damage while it's doing it. And then once you line them up, and this is what it'll look like when you're actually moving it. You'll take paper and fold it. You'll keep them their distance apart. And this piece right here typically is not actually the head. The head is right here on the end, right on the very end. They did the same kind of thing that IBM did like in the 50s. They basically put a slider mechanism on here to hold the head because the head is so small that there's nothing to mount it to. And so they've got to do something basically to give it some pizzazz there. So it mounts on the end of that. And you'll also see, too, from the way that this piece of metal moves, you can see that the whole idea of the hard drive was made so that when the pressure from the air was spinning up and the drives and platters were spinning up, the pressure is what's pushing up on that. So you can see how flexible these things were. And they're actually made as a triangle on purpose because it gives it the most rigidity at the end and takes off all the extra metal, and then they cut all the holes in it. And that's the same thing for the holes down here on the arm, where the airflow actually helps, kind of like the wing of an airplane, push those apart in a certain pattern so that you can actually make that head float. This is what it looks like when it's bad news. If your piece of paper falls out, and that's another good thing too, is that when you're doing this, you need to be in a spot where somebody's not bumping your arm. So you need to make sure that there's nobody standing behind you or any of that kind of stuff, and just kind of lock the door or whatever, and make sure that that does not hit each other at all, because if your arm gets bumped and that little piece of paper falls out, it's game over. You're not gonna be able to do it with this. Just stop right there, close it back up, and go back to eBay. And go get another drive. Start all over again. So now you're ramping up your cost though, but most of the time you can buy these older drives or anything that's like 250 and below, easily 69 bucks, 70 bucks. So most of the time you're gonna save still a lot of money. This is what that ramp looks like. Now this one happened to be an IBM, and it's got these little fingers on it that actually help line it up on the ramp. These are great, because if you've got one of these, then, and so you open up your drive and you see that, it's like, woo, I got a party going on. Because this is going to help you a lot, get that thing lined back up. If you don't have a ramp on it, then it's going to be hard to try to get it in the exact spot so that when the head comes back out onto the platter, it doesn't drag the bottom of the head along the platter and just scrape it right back off. Because once that happens, the rest of the thing is going to dig into it like an airplane. It's just going to crash right into that platter and scratch the crap out of it, and so your good data is no longer good. It's actually going to be gone. This, I think, is completely plausible and possible, and I've done it. This is 4 heads on 2 platters, and it's great that there's a ramp there. You don't usually see a ramp when you got 4, but I got lucky in this particular one. So be very, very cautious and take your time to line those back up on that ramp, because if you mess that up, and the second that you power it back up, it's going to be over. And make sure you reassemble back all of this stuff over here, because the locking mechanisms and things like that, if you don't do it right and you don't get them back on right, or you just say, oh, that's a locking, just throw it away, what'll happen is when the heads come back out, they'll fly right off, and they just keep right on going. It's gone. So, and once that happens, it'll never come back, because as soon as because it'll try to draw it back in, and it'll just scratch the heads right off the platter and blah, blah. So this one is a little bit harder, but this one is completely possible and plausible. The problem here is that these mount on the inside. So tweezers are extremely good for this, especially like surgical tweezers. So there's tweezers that push out, and there's tweezers that push in. So you want to get some that push out. And so you basically are going to do like a game of operation here. You're going to be very cautious. You're going to turn it on its side. You're going to go down the side here, and you're going to put the tweezers around it and push them apart. And then this one's going to take 2 people to do it right, because you've got to move this set of heads back onto a live, good platter without touching it and park them back in the same spot. It can be done a little bit longer, 2.5 hours or so. It takes a little bit of practice. But again, we're only talking about that last 5%, last 4% of the drives that you can do that. If you see this, then you can just start praying, because it's never going to happen. You're not going to do it. It's not going to be able to be recovered. This is a SCSI drive with 16 heads, 9 platters. It's bad. It's gone. You'll never even get this mechanism out of here without scratching the platters in the first place, but I think it can't be done not this way. So let's look at some of the platter damage and when you know you can just pretty much quit. This is what happens, and the head will keep on moving. It'll keep going, and the drive will keep trying to read the data, and it'll keep moving along, and it'll just scratch that platter. This is what it looks like. This one is an IBM hard drive. This one's a ceramic glass platter, and If you guys look at the picture on the myharddrive.com, you'll see that you can see through the platter. It really is glass. And so it scratched it. This one's kind of unique. It scratched both heads on both sides, scratched all the way across the platter. And so it dug off all the oxide, and you can see right through it. And it's pretty cool to look at while it's spinning and stuff, but that's... And this guy got really mad. This guy, like, I called him back and I said, there's no way that you're going to ever get this data back. And he goes, I don't believe you. I want you to box it up, and I'm going to take it to somebody else. And so when he got there, I had, like, taken all the little pixie dust, and I put it in a little bag. And I said, you're right. All you got to do is sprinkle this once in a while, and you'll see your data again. He did not have that reaction. Everybody else in the office did, but he... $50. I do like a $50 valuation. Here's the other key from that question, is that every data recovery house, and they don't want you to know this because you can hold them hostage, they do all the work before they tell you they can recover it. Like OnTrack says, well, we examined your drive and we'll send you a list. And this is what we can recover. It's not what they can recover. They did recover it. They're not going to even send you the list until they've already got all the data back and they already have it secure someplace. Because they only have one chance. If that drive dies in that process and they sent you this list, well, now they got liability. Oh, you had my data, but now you can't get it? What do you mean? So things like that happen. They already do it, and it's already done, and it's already sitting on a drive. $1 valuation fee, and because I'm already dealing with like corporate clients and things like that, it's not really a problem. I just tell them yes, no, good, bad, whatever, and I get like 98% of everything back. So it worked out pretty well for me. This is a drive where the head hit the platter, and I kind of just turned it sideways so you can see the light. This is that checkerboard pattern. It was basically skipping. It was, and you're not going to get that back either. That one's pretty much done. And this is a good example of somebody who tried to do their own before they actually gave it to me and continued on. This is the other thing. It actually started out making these little tiny S's. Again, it kind of started skipping, but like a little piece of the metal dinged it. And so as the head's moving along, it's whacking the platter until it eventually does just do a complete scrape like this. But you'll get these little S's. So if you see the little S's, you're done there too. Motor failure. You'll be lucky if it moves at all like this when you have motor failure. This is the reason why you can't do one with the motor failure. When you take them off, the only thing that's in between these two platters, if you have two, if you have one, you can do it. You can move, you can buy another drive exactly like it. You can take that platter out and you can move it to another platter and you're in good shape. But if you got two, they spin freely as soon as you do this, and this little piece right here is nothing. There's no grid, there's no nothing. It's all held by pressure, and so you can see you just can't, and you can't remove that motor. That motor's part of the casing. This is actually just a cap for the motor, and so once you do that, the spindle won't be able to be removed and replaced. So again, this is one of those reasons why you can't do a multi-platter. When you have a multi-platter and you try to move two platters at once, because that servo information is actually what's making up that cylinder, you'll never line it back up again, and you'll never get it moved over to another drive after you've done it. So once you remove those screws off the top of the platter, you're done too. So, and then it's all in the garbage, all of it. So good, the bad, the whole thing, just write your data off. Yes, sir? Yeah, and there actually is like a small little area that's already set up around it, and you can do that, but it's really difficult to get multiple ones. I mean, there's no device that does it that I know of, and so you've got to do it, you know, again, and it's kind of the lowest common denominator. A lot of us are like, you know, there's an extreme amount of work once you get to this level, and there's no device that I know of that does that. I've been working on some things, but I haven't gotten anything that works quite right, like taking surgical clamps and making 2 and 3 levels of them, but you can't get them just right. And if it moves even a micron, it's over. Yes, sir?
Can you use an external motor?
Well, I've tried a couple of things. If it's not spinning at exactly the right speed, it will cause a problem. It wants to spin. It knows exactly how it needs to spin. And this is another good example of when your motor might be bad, but it does actually spin. That little teetering component that sits on the outside of the drive where it unlocks the arm, if your platters do not spin at the right speed, it's not enough pressure to move that clamp out of the way, and that's a good indication your drive's actually spinning slower than it's supposed to. Without, you know, it's still a damaged motor, but it's extremely difficult to try to use another motor unless you're going to like drill through the middle of the motor I mean, you've got all kinds of issues there. And you can't turn one over and run it the other way, like back to back, because they spin in the opposite direction. So, yes, sir?
Do you know how much redundancy is built into the ECC?
I've watched Smart many, many times to try to figure out. Here's another thing about Smart is that Smart like clears itself like every 3 months. So like whatever data it writes and says, oh yeah, I had a bad block like 6 months ago, blah, 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 it's already cleared, and now Smart starts all over again. So it's not really giving you good data back. So the data is always on the fly. It's always stored at the time that it's running, and you don't usually get good responses back. So I'm not really sure of a good way to do. Yes, sir?
Hard drive's going bad. You find it's always just one piece that's gone bad. For example, if you swap out the controller.
Most of the time. Yeah, I know what you're getting to, but the only chance that that's usually not true is that some extreme cases of lightning have caused the head hit splatters, and there's one of the other things too is like once you know that you're going to have to buy new parts on eBay, it might be a really good idea just to open up the casing of the drive, just to take a quick look to see if you actually have physical platter damage or if the pillow itself that's on the outside of the filter has silver oxide on it. Because if either of those are true, don't waste your time going to eBay because it's going to be too bad. But I have only seen a handful of cases where both things are bad. Typically, it's not true. Typically, one's bad. Yes, sir?
What does the clicking of a dead hard drive imply, and is that recoverable?
Yes, it can be. A lot of times it is the physical board itself, but most of the time the head is trying to get the data off of like the beginning of the sectors to try to tell you what the MFT or something is on that drive. And that's one other really good thing is there's a tool I use that's called, and if you're doing Windows recoveries, it's really neat. It's called MFT Explorer, and it's from Runtime. It actually will read the MFT or the FAT sectors off of the drive and tell you where the sectors are of the folders that you want. And they don't, and then you don't have to like scan the whole drive and try to read the whole drive. You can just go straight after the one piece of data you want. We can take questions outside or something else, or anything else? Thank you. What's that?
You wound up having a chip explode on his board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do that.